Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Literature. Today we're going to be focusing on how we write introductions to our poetry essays so that we can ensure that we are structuring our essay in order to get the maximum number of AO1 grades. This session is meant to complement your lessons with your teachers and not to replace them in any way. Okay, so last session we had a look at this question: compare how poets present ideas about conflict in Bayonet Charge and in one other poem, and we planned that essay using exposure. At the end of that session we looked at what a thesis statement was. We're going to go back over that again. We're going to talk about why it's super important, and then we're going to look at how we write an introduction. So essentially your essay is like a skeleton, and your thesis statement is the head, and everything else hangs off that thesis statement. If there's no head, everything else falls apart, and everything is coming back to that single line that runs all the way through, which is your argument and your answer. And so if you don't know what your answer to the question is, your essay is never going to hang together. And if you don't keep linking back from your paragraphs to your answer to that question, then your essay is going to lack a coherent structure. And if we go back to what is expected of you from AO1, AO1 requires you to be able to write an essay, essentially. And writing an essay in and of itself is a skill. It is not just necessary that you understand the poems, you need to know how to build an argument and how to answer a question. So, following our plan, we identified that both poets suggest that war is pointless and negative, but they use very different methods to do this. We are going to essentially use that as our thesis statement. However, when we say war is pointless and negative, we are going to need to put some more meat on the bones around negative. So we are going to look at the fact that they affect you both mentally and physically. So we identified that both poets have different ways of doing this. They have different ways of putting that point across. However, both poets identified that it was pointless. Okay. So if we identified that as our thesis statement, that is essentially what we're trying to prove throughout our essay. So that thesis statement is going to sit within our introduction. However, what we also know is that AO1 requires us to write an essay. Sorry. So the ability to write an introduction is important. AO1 also requires us to have understood the texts. So we need to show in that introduction that we understand both the poems, because the introduction is the first time that anyone's going to read anything you have to say. The introduction is how you set yourself up for the rest of the essay. That is not to say a bad introduction will take away marks from you, but a good introduction can set you up to ensure that your marks are easier to get and ensure that your essay is more coherent. So, writing an essay, writing an introduction, that is shown from our thesis statement. Understanding the text, we need to be really clear about what happens in both texts, but in a really precise way. AO2 is about writer's intention and writer's craft, and therefore we need to identify in that introduction what they do and acknowledge them as writers. We need to remember all the time that these texts are constructs. They are not real life. They are something that someone has put together, and therefore we have to understand them in that way, that the words are put in specific places, that the punctuation is put in specific places. And then AO3 is context. And so again, if we can acknowledge that in our introduction, if we can hit all of those assessment objectives in our introduction, we don't have to work as hard, and we have already started to tick boxes for an examiner. Remembering that this is 40%, this is 40%, and this is 20%. And essentially that should be how they are weighted in your paragraphs. So I'm going to show you now an example of an introduction, and we will go through where we are hitting those assessment objectives. Your introduction does not have to be incredibly long, okay? The more precise it is, the more succinct it can be, the quicker you get on to writing about the actual quotations that you are picking out of those poems. So, first of all, both poets present conflict as something that can affect you mentally as well as physically. We're acknowledging that there are two poets, we're acknowledging that we're talking about two poems. Again, you need to do this as soon as is humanly possible, because not writing about two poems is a limiting factor. There is an answer to our question. Then we take each poem in turn. In Bayonet Charge, conflict is shown as something confusing and fast-paced. That shows my understanding of the poem, that shows that I understand what the poem is about. Exposure, the speaker presents an experience in which nothing happens. Again, that shows my understanding of exposure. So we are already at the point where we have hit assessment objective 1 and 2. I have talked about both poems, and therefore I have taken away that limiting factor. I'm then going to develop that thesis statement further. Both poems suggest that people are questioning their place in the war and the validity of the conflict. This is where not only are we hitting assessment objective 1, but we are starting to talk about assessment objective 3. Then we take that one stage further and we show what we know. Wilfred Owen wrote exposure during his own personal experience in the trenches during World War I, and his anger and disappointment are clear to see. That's a personal response to that poem. Ted Hughes did not serve, and this could explain why they present the experience of war differently. So you can see from that that the introduction does not have to be incredibly long, but what you have in there is that you have hit every single assessment objective. You have made your thesis statement clear. You have made it clear what you're going to be doing throughout the essay. What you should now do, at the end of this last session, I asked you to plan the essay using remains instead of exposure. Now, using that plan, write the introduction to your essay where you are comparing Bayonet Charge and Remains.